George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, led America through a tumultuous period. His presidency, from 2001 to 2009, was marked by events that continue to spark debate and shape his legacy. From the disputed 2000 election to the attacks of 9/11 and the subsequent War on Terror, Bush's decisions reverberate even today. His handling of Hurricane Katrina and the 2008 financial crisis also drew intense scrutiny. Bush's supporters often point to his steadfast leadership in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. They credit him with keeping America safe during a period of immense vulnerability. However, critics counter that his decisions, particularly the invasion of Iraq, destabilized the Middle East and had disastrous consequences. They also fault his administration's response to Hurricane Katrina as slow and inadequate. The passage of time allows for greater perspective on Bush's presidency, yet the controversies surrounding his actions ensure that his legacy remains a subject of intense discussion. The 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was one of the closest and most controversial in American history. The outcome hinged on the state of Florida, where a razor-thin margin separated the candidates. A lengthy recount process ensued, mired in legal challenges and accusations of irregularities. The Supreme Court's decision to halt the recount ultimately handed the presidency to Bush. The 2000 election left a lasting mark on American politics. It exposed flaws in the electoral system and heightened partisan divisions. The bitterness of the contest cast a long shadow on Bush's presidency, with many Americans questioning the legitimacy of his victory. Bush's opponents argued that he entered office with a diminished mandate, having lost the popular vote and only narrowly securing the presidency through a Supreme Court decision. This, they contend, undermined his ability to govern effectively. Supporters, however, countered that Bush won the election fair and square, pointing to the final certified vote count in Florida. The shadow of the 2000 election loomed large over Bush's presidency, shaping perceptions of his legitimacy and influencing the political landscape for years to come. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, irrevocably altered the course of George W. Bush's presidency. The images of that day, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers, the smoldering Pentagon, the wreckage of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania, seared themselves into the national consciousness. In the aftermath of the attacks, Bush declared a war on terror and vowed to hunt down those responsible. The attacks on 9/11 transformed Bush into a wartime president. He rallied a grieving nation, promising to bring the perpetrators to justice. His approval ratings soared as Americans united in their grief and outrage. However, the war on terror would prove to be a long and costly endeavor, with far-reaching consequences for the United States and the world. Bush's response to 9/11 was swift and decisive. He ordered the invasion of Afghanistan, toppling the Taliban regime that had harbored Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. While initially popular, the war on terror eventually became deeply divisive. The 2003 invasion of Iraq stands as one of the most consequential and controversial decisions of George W. Bush's presidency. Citing intelligence reports that Saddam Hussein's regime possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and had ties to terrorist groups, the Bush administration launched a military campaign to remove Hussein from power. The invasion of Iraq was highly divisive from the outset. Millions around the world took to the streets in protest, questioning the Bush administration's rationale for war. Critics argued that the intelligence on WMDs was flawed, and that the invasion was driven by a neoconservative agenda for regime change in the Middle East. The invasion of Iraq had profound consequences for the region and beyond. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime created a power vacuum that contributed to the rise of sectarian violence and the emergence of ISIS. The war exacted a heavy toll in terms of both human life and financial cost. The failure to find any stockpiles of WMDs in Iraq, coupled with the chaotic aftermath of the invasion, tarnished the Bush administration's credibility and fueled accusations of deception. The invasion of Iraq remains a deeply polarizing issue. George W. Bush's service in the Texas Air National Guard during the Vietnam War, became a subject of intense scrutiny during his political career. Critics questioned whether Bush had fulfilled his service obligations and whether he had received preferential treatment due to his family's political connections. The controversy over Bush's military service resurfaced during the 2004 presidential election. Opponents accused him of being a draft dodger, alleging that he had used his family's influence to avoid serving in Vietnam. Bush defended his record, maintaining that he had fulfilled his duty and had received no special treatment. The debate over Bush's military service tapped into broader societal divisions about the Vietnam War. It also raised questions about privilege, fairness, and the obligations of citizenship. Bush's supporters argued that the attacks on his service record were politically motivated and lacked merit. They pointed to his honorable discharge from the National Guard as evidence of his commitment. The controversy surrounding Bush's military service, while ultimately inconclusive, served to further polarize the electorate. Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the Gulf Coast in August 2005, presented George W. Bush with one of the most significant domestic crises of his presidency. The storm's catastrophic impact on New Orleans, coupled with the slow and inadequate response from government agencies, exposed vulnerabilities in disaster preparedness and relief efforts. The images of suffering and devastation in the wake of Katrina shocked the nation. The slow federal response, particularly in aiding the predominantly black residents of New Orleans, drew sharp criticism. Bush's initial visit to the region, in which he was seen flying over the flooded city in Air Force One, was widely perceived as detached and insensitive. The Bush administration faced accusations of incompetence and indifference in its handling of the Katrina disaster. Critics charged that the government had failed to adequately prepare for a storm of Katrina's magnitude and had been slow to respond to the needs of those affected. The crisis exposed racial and economic disparities in American society, as well as systemic failures in disaster management. The perception that the government had failed to protect its citizens, particularly the most vulnerable, lingered long after the floodwaters receded. Hurricane Katrina tested the limits of American resilience and exposed the shortcomings in its disaster response infrastructure. George W. Bush's economic policies were a defining feature of his presidency. He championed tax cuts to stimulate growth, arguing it would boost spending and investment. However, his record is mixed, marked by growth and a financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis cast a long shadow over his legacy. The administration's bailout was praised for preventing a meltdown but criticized for rewarding recklessness. George W. Bush's presidency, bookended by the contested 2000 election and the 2008 financial crisis, was a period of profound consequence for the United States and the world. His legacy is complex and contested, shaped by events that continue to reverberate today. Bush's supporters view him as a resolute leader who kept America safe in the aftermath of 9/11. They credit him with launching the War on Terror, toppling the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, and liberating the Iraqi people from Saddam Hussein's brutal dictatorship. They also point to his domestic achievements, including education reform and the expansion of HIV/AIDS treatment programs. Bush's critics argue that he was a deeply flawed president whose decisions, particularly the invasion of Iraq, had disastrous consequences. They fault his administration's handling of Hurricane Katrina and the 2008 financial crisis. They also criticize his tax cuts, which they say exacerbated income inequality and ballooned the federal budget deficit. History will continue to grapple with the legacy of George W. Bush. His presidency was marked by both triumphs and tragedies, moments of unity and periods of deep division. The passage of time allows for greater perspective on George W. Bush's presidency. The passions of the moment have cooled, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the challenges he faced and the choices he made. Bush's presidency was forged in the fires of 9/11, reshaping America's role in the world. The invasion of Iraq remains a source of intense debate. His handling of Hurricane Katrina raised questions about his leadership in times of crisis. Ultimately, the verdict on George W. Bush's presidency rests with history.